I don't want your suffering. I don't want your future.
This is FNGR covering X-Men Days of Future Past, for no good reason. I went into the Godzilla review with a different set of standards. I didn't mean this in a backhanded way, but a giant monster movie should be graded differently from a Marvel movie these days. I'm old enough to realize how funny, or at least ironic, it is to say Marvel movie and quality and mean it. I went into X-Men Days of Future Past a little reluctant. I know the story from the comic and from the cartoon back in the day, the good one. It's just when you open up time travel in a Marvel setting, that's a whole new bag of nuts, that if you overuse it, you can really sink the whole ship. If you follow Marvel, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Spoilers, we're having those, so yeah. Fear not, I deeply recommend you watch this movie, and if you haven't, go watch it right now. I've seen the first 3 X-Men and stopped. I kinda liked the first one, not to say certain parts didn't bug me. The second one was fine, and I enjoyed how it wrapped up in the third, because I liked the Jean Grey Wolverine ship. But let's get back to this movie. It's the future, a bunch of people are dead, or rather missing and presumed dead. The Sentinels have arrived and wiped out mutants, and their mutant sympathizers. Now, there's a character called Blink, who long since has been killed off in the comics when Generation X previewed, but knowing Marvel, they likely brought her back at some point. It's just, I never got to see her beyond a brief period, and for me, this was a bit of an Easter egg of sorts. Anyway, one of the new mutants can project your subconscious back in time, granting the characters the ability to cheat death repeatedly. This leads to one of the 2 nitpicks I have for this movie. The power itself is fine, it's just the movie ends up sending Wolverine back in time for what feels like a couple of days of non-stop meditation. The other nitpick being is that it's a time travel movie, we don't get ripples in time, despite the fact that we get flashbacks to the future from time to time. I understand that part would have greatly increased the movie's budget, so it's not a deal breaker. Not to mention, I believe the movie ended up having a $200 million budget. Just go watch the credits, they seem to really go on. Positives? Hell, take your pick. I never really enjoyed Quicksilver as a character, till now. We get an 18-year-old rebellious Quicksilver that Wolverine calls on to help break out Magneto out of prison. Now I know the idea of a young, rebellious kid sounds potentially tiresome. His wit, his actions, felt like he could get his own movie. Until now, I never cared about his character in the least. Evan Peters. His name doesn't ring a bell, but if he can do more work like this, we might have another Ledger or even at least a Johnny Depp. And I, for one, don't see that as a problem. I skipped ahead a little bit, and there's a scene where Wolverine has to convince Professor Xavier he's from the future, where Xavier doesn't have his powers due to a drug he's been taking to help correct his physical impairment. Beast's character is taking a similar drug, but he seems to be able to shake off its influence easier. I just noticed that. It hardly bothers me. Wolverine is given the spotlight for a fair share of this movie, but he's not the only focus, and he seems to flow from primary to secondary character. Whether it's Quicksilver's scene stealing, where he literally impishly is pushing bullets out of the way, and I swear it doesn't look stupid, or the moral arguments between Magneto and Professor X in the past, or Trask's need to protect humanity from the mutant menace. Oh, and by the way, the Trask character, he happens to be Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones. I hadn't realized at the time, but there was so much crap going on in the movie, his retro 70s look threw me off. Now, this next point isn't a major thing to me, for those who like characters with reasonable motivations, and this movie does do this. Technically, the movie doesn't have an over-the-top villain who's either greedy or selfish. Everyone seemingly has the best intentions at heart. Wolverine wants to save the future for mutants. Magneto in the past has the best intentions for mutant kind at heart. Mystique wants to kill Trask for trying to make Sentinels to catch mutants. And Trask wants to stop mutants from endangering humans. If I had to pick out a selfish character, Professor Xavier in the past has given up teaching mutants and turned inwardly to drinking and isolation. Wolverine, aka Logan, despite being an unlikely candidate, is the character who has to convince Professor X and Magneto to stop Mystique from killing Trask, which leads to the Sentinel Project getting the support it needs in his absence. Of the movies I've seen with Mystique, this one gives her a fair amount of characterization, instead of just being the mysterious shape-shifting bitch and Magneto lackey. Ultimately, she sets off on her goal, free of Magneto's whim, and honestly, it's a refreshing change of pace. Magneto ultimately, when push comes to shove, tries to set things right, including trying to kill Mystique because her DNA is partially responsible for allowing Sentinels the ability to adapt to mutant powers, due to her getting captured after she kills Trask. It's the major difference in philosophies of doing what's right versus doing what's necessary, that Magneto and Trask ultimately seem to have the same morals, and the ends justify the means. Due to Wolverine's presence, the past has changed enough so that Trask survives and Mystique isn't captured. Trask gets the immediate funding for the Sentinels as far back as Richard Nixon. Magneto sneaks into the train convoy, carrying the Sentinels, and lines them with metal, as Trask explains earlier that they're made out of a non-metallic polymer. Now, there's a scene later on where Magneto is able to affect their programming, instead of just manipulating their bodies like puppets. It doesn't bug me, I'm just going to point that out. The final blowout battle involves Beast, Magneto, Wolverine, Professor X, Mystique, Trask, and Richard Nixon. No, you heard me. Richard Nixon. Do you like mutant powers? Do you like engaging plots? Do you like epic showdowns with Richard Nixon? My brain kind of shuts off every time I say that. Not in a bad way. It's just this movie, at least for me, pulls off so many things that don't feel like they should work. There's a minor story with the backdrop being the end of the Vietnam War, where we get a mutant platoon of sorts. They do tie it into the main plot, but do you really care? It's a military mutant platoon. That's just fucking cool. Hell, I could have watched a movie about them. There's so many things in this movie that Marvel could come back to for a sequel or a prequel, including a goodie at the end of the credits I won't spoil. I don't mean this in a backhanded way when I say this movie is the best of 2014. It's an excellent benchmark. I can't wait to see what Marvel cooks up next. So till next time, don't ask why a field burns or a plague spreads. For no good reason.